Tonight on History Detectives.
These guns mean a lot to me. Who is John P. Thompson?
Were these people members of the Klan? I hope that's not what I'm getting ready to run into.
I have an amplifier that I believe belonged to the great James Jamerson, that Motown guy. Who is that guy?
Watching the detectives get so angry when the teardrops start, but you can't move it 'cause you got no heart. Watching the detectives, it's just like watching the detectives.
Funding for tonight's presentation of History Detectives was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
In the late 70s, my dad purchased these guns from an antique dealer. These guns mean a lot to me because Dad gave them to me the year my son was born. John P. Thompson, Owensboro, Kentucky. They were praised on the Antique Roadshow.
Really interested in this pair of pistols. For retail, they would probably bring today around $30,000. And that's without knowing who Mr. Thompson is.
So I want to know, who is John P. Thompson?
These ornate pistols would have been expensive when they were made. Whoever he was, John P. Thompson was no ordinary soldier. And there's something else. This investigation hits mighty close to home.
This is an exciting story for me because I'm from Kentucky. I spent an awful lot of time 40 or 50 miles from Owensboro, Kentucky. I grew up hearing about my great-great-grandpa Sam, who was a Confederate, and he was a member of the 10th Kentucky Cavalry. So to see these pistols with this guy, John P. Thompson, from Owensboro, Kentucky, man, the bells started ringing. Dulcie, I know what's in the box here because you brought these to the Antiques Roadshow in Pittsburgh, right?
Yes.
Wow. So there's an escutcheon here that says John P. Thompson, Owensboro, Kentucky. They're absolutely beautiful. What did you think they were used for?
I thought that they had something to do with the Civil War because of the paperwork here.
Inside the pistol case, Dulcie found a prison parole document dated May 1865, just 1 month after the war's end. It gives Thompson's rank and his regiment.
I, the undersigned prisoner of war, belonging to the 12th Battalion Kentucky Cavalry, Jack P. Thompson, Major 12th Kentucky Cavalry. Looks like he got this at the end of the war and he's being paroled after being a prisoner of war.
Dulcie wants to know if the pistols saw action in the war and more about their owner.
So I'm ready to get going.
Thank you.
The pistols are Derringers, made in Philadelphia, and their ornate design and likely price tag suggest that Major Thompson may have been someone prominent. He certainly took up arms in one of the most divided and dangerous areas of the country.
Probably nowhere more in the United States did you see brother fighting against brother. It was a war that literally tore this state apart.
Pressed between North and South, the Bluegrass State did eventually back the Union, but tens of thousands of Kentuckians were staunch Confederates. Both John P. Thompson and my relative were among them. My great-great-grandfather Sam fought in the 10th Kentucky Cavalry, commanded by John Hunt Morgan. His was a guerrilla force which raided deep behind Union lines.
John P. Thompson was in the 12th Kentucky Cavalry, but, you know, during the war, the 10th and the 12th could certainly have been under the same command, and they might have known each other, who knows?
From what I know about guns, Derringers were not your typical battlefield weapon. I've reached out to my friend Chris Mitchell. He's a weapons specialist who first looked at Dulcie's pistols on the Antiques Roadshow. He wants to show me how the Derringer works, but doesn't want to risk firing Dulcie's. So he's brought his own.
I just happen to have it right here. You would never know it. Take the powder and pour it down the muzzle.
Then we're gonna put the patch on top. Then we're gonna take our rammer. All right, well now we have the gun loaded. We're gonna take our percussion cap. We're gonna keep the barrel pointed in a safe direction, and we'll head out to the range.
Let's go.
We'll stand roughly 25 feet from the target.
All right, take your aim and let's see what we can do. You went over it.
I went over it. I didn't hit the target.
There you go.
It took me 3 tries to even hit the target. And that's the point Chris wanted to make. As we head inside, he explains that Derringer was not terribly useful at long distance on the field of battle, but it was popular because it could be hidden and packed a punch at short range.
These could be used for protection. You know, you could carry them in your coat pocket. If you're in a close fight or in a hand-to-hand situation, this is definitely usable.
Chris says the Derringer's short barrel and large caliber made it a favorite of gamblers, outlaws, and assassins.
Probably is the reason that most, even kids today, know that name. It's a Derringer pistol that John Wilkes Booth used to kill Abraham Lincoln.
He doesn't know who Thompson was, but his guns were lethal, stealthy, and self-contained.
You have this wonderful idea that everything I need to make these guns function is with me in this box.
Right.
This is the bullet mold that you would have used to make your bullets. This is the little brass loading rod that you would have used to actually load the guns. And then here we have the powder flask that would have held the powder and helped us measure the charge.
Chris agrees the guns were almost certainly owned by someone of means.
These are more, guns for a gentleman. This case and all is an element of prestige. This is all about
Showing off.
its status.
And he spotted something else.
Somebody has used these guns, there's no question. The tools, everything has been used.
Gentleman officer, assassin, spy. Exactly who was Major John P. Thompson? And how had he used these pistols? I can tell you, it's going to be a challenge to run this guy down. Thompson is such a common name.
Let me just look at the census data from 1860 from Owensboro, Kentucky. Owensboro, Kentucky. Daviess County, Kentucky. Look at that. John P. Thompson, born about 1832. He's listed as the clerk of the circuit court, and his real estate is worth $10,000, and he has $15,000 worth of personal property. I'll bet you that he had slaves at the start of the Civil War.
Sure enough, a slave census from that same year shows the Thompson family owning 9 slaves, the majority of whom are young men in their 20s. If this is the same John P. Thompson on the pistols, he certainly could have afforded them. I've made an appointment with research associate Tony Curtis at the Kentucky Historical Society.
Hey, how are you?
I've sent him pictures of the guns and scans of the parole document.
Okay, here are the pistols that I was telling you about in Case Derringers, both of them with this German silver escutcheon, John P. Thompson, Owensboro, Kentucky. Now, with the pistols was this document. And this is a parole near the end of the war issued to a guy named Jack P. Thompson.
Well, I think we have the sources here to look a little bit further into this.
Let's go.
Let's pull a couple of these volumes to look at.
Oh, prisoner of war.
Yes.
Okay. Military history of the Daviess County, Kentucky area.
The title of the book is telling, At War with Ourselves. Both President Lincoln and Confederate President Jefferson Davis were from Kentucky, and the book details the tug of war over the border state. Loyalties were divided, town by town, county by county. Although Kentucky chose to remain with the Union, pro-Southern sympathizers set up a shadow government recognized by the Confederacy as early as 1862.
Oh, take a look at this. The first man, not only in Daviess County, but also the entire state, to raise a company of soldiers for the Confederate Army was Captain John Jack Thompson of Owensboro. And he was in this early war regiment called the Dixie Guard.
And it's a local unit of men who were put together by sometimes a prominent leader in the community.
Like the rest of the state, Owensboro was especially divided on the issue of slavery. Later in the war, local African Americans would sign up to fight for their freedom, while prosperous slave owners often sided with the Confederacy.
I know from the 1860 census that he, in fact, was the clerk of courts for Daviess County, and he was a fairly wealthy guy.
That makes perfect sense then.
John P. Thompson of Owensboro was a zealous defender of the South. I'm almost certain it's the same guy who owned these pistols. But one thing I don't know, exactly how was he captured? Time to look at the Confederate prisoner of war records.
Should I look through one?
You look through that one, and I will look through this one.
I got a hit. John P. Thompson, page 970. Executive Department, Richmond, June 10th, 1863. So this is from the Confederate government. Honorable Secretary of War, sir, I am informed that Major John P. Thompson has been arrested in Owensboro, Kentucky, and sentenced to be shot as a spy. He was a gallant soldier and has probably been taken attempting to recruit. Wow.
Although Kentucky was now officially backing the Union, Thompson had deep roots in his former hometown.
So it's interesting, he was sent back by the Confederate War Department, apparently, to Owensboro to recruit more Confederate soldiers.
He still had those connections in Owensboro, so he would have gone back to the town. When he's in Owensboro, he may have distributed pamphlets, leaflets. He would have tapped into those same networks.
And that would make sense. I mean, the guy was connected.
With this information, I can dig a little deeper into his prison record. Local Union forces captured Thompson on May 17, 1863, crossing the Ohio River outside of Owensboro. Seems Thompson avoided the firing squad after Confederate officials pled for leniency.
Appears on a roll of prisoners of war, depot prisoners of war near Sandusky. So that's Johnson's Island.
That is Johnson's Island.
Johnson's Island was an officers' POW camp in the middle of Lake Erie. After his release, Thompson settled in Virginia, marrying a woman he had met at the start of the war.
Wow. Quite a paper trail that was left behind. Tony, I cannot thank you enough.
With this new information, I'm going to see if someone back at my office can help me track down a living relative. I'm confident these pistols were owned by the same John P. Thompson I've been tracking, but I want to be certain.
Absolutely, I can look into that for you.
Terrific. See ya.
The office came through. I'm headed to Virginia.
I'm on my way to visit the great-great-granddaughter of John P. Thompson. Man.
Wes, what a pleasure.
You must be Leslie.
I am indeed. I'm so
Wow.
delighted for you to be here.
So you're John P. Thompson's great-great-granddaughter.
That's correct.
Do I have a lot of questions for you?
I bet you do.
Leslie's pride in her family history is evident. The house is kept as a family museum and filled with ancestral relics. Leslie spent years researching genealogy and cataloging the Thompsons' storied history from before the Civil War to the present. She's eager to fill me in on John Thompson's past.
He went by Jack. That was his familiar name.
Okay, well,
And
that
so we in the
makes sense.
family refer to him as Jack or Major Jack. His father was Philip Thompson, and his father served, as a matter of fact, in the U.S. Congress, 1823 to 1825. He was very prominent, was considered one of the richest people in Owensboro at that time.
Leslie says that Jack was a prolific letter writer, especially to the love of his life, Nelia, who he courted during the war.
I have 88 surviving letters that he wrote. This was written to Miss Nelia. And do you know what this is? His letter of proposal of marriage.
Oh, my word.
This letter would have been written when he was on the march. He writes, Wednesday night, June 11th, 1862. You are a diamond among gems, a pearl amid seashells.
Wow, that's an amazing letter.
Isn't that beautiful?
What a treasure.
In addition to preserving her ancestors' romantic correspondence, Leslie's family also has an incredible record of Jack's wartime activities.
He wanted to be part of the guerrilla raids going back into Kentucky to recruit for the southern side. And this one is actually showing here. This has Major John P. Thompson. So he was promoted in rank at this time and was appointed, should you accept, you will report for duty to Brigadier General John H. Morgan. So he was under the umbrella of John Hunt Morgan.
Guess what?
What?
So was my great-great-grandfather.
Oh, what a small world.
And he was from Waverly, Kentucky, which is about 40 miles from Owensboro.
Oh my gosh, that's remarkable. I'd also like to show you this, Attention Kentuckians. So written from Camp Hawes, Athens, East Tennessee, March 1st, 1863.
It's a handbill recruiting volunteers to flock to the rebel cause.
Oh, listen to this. Come in such numbers as at least will fill the Kentucky regiments and battalions to drive the invader beyond the borders of your native state. Rally for the redemption of Kentucky. So this is what he would have carried with him when he went back to Owensboro to recruit, and he was handing these things out. Oh, this is fabulous.
Yeah.
There is no mention of the Derringers in the family papers. But what Leslie shows me next will almost certainly be a shock to Dulcie.
Well, this was a great story. But I say that with every history detective story. It's always a great story. This one was particularly great.
I filled Dulcie in on a lot of details about John P. Thompson's early life.
He was a slave owner. He organized the very first Confederate regiment in Kentucky. Through a little bit of genealogical work, we were able to discover his great-great-granddaughter.
It's unbelievable.
Right here is where his pistols sat, and as a matter of fact, I have a photograph of that. This shows the complete set along with his photo at the time that they sat here on the table.
Do you know how amazing that is?
It's quite something.
For my story, I mean, this is sort of puts everything together.
Leslie explains the pistols were treasured heirlooms and sat on the table in a place of honor. But in the 1970s, her grandmother told the family an intruder broke into the house and stole them. No one has seen them since.
There are the set of pistols.
Oh, well, that's very moving. I know all the women and past relatives are very happy at this moment. That's really moving.
Well, we'd pick one up.
Oh. They mean so much more than just the beauty and the intrinsic value of what they are as pistols in a set. After Jack died, Nelia brought them back here to her home, and she placed them over there on that table, and they sat there enshrined, sort of the holy family relics. They became an expression of him and his spirit.
I can't tell you how remarkable an experience that's been.
And for me as well. For me as well.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful.
But I had some startling news for Dulcie. Leslie's family said the pistols had been stolen in the 70s.
I don't know what to say. I kind of just want to cry.
The family felt the same way when they saw him. They started crying.
Thank you for telling me who he was.
John P. Thompson passed away in 1872. He and his beloved Nelia had 3 children. When I began this investigation, I had no idea it would prove so fascinating or complicated. Delicate questions of ownership often come up in the world of antiques, and while it's not our place to determine title, it's obvious that these guns have long been treasured by both families. After filming, we learned that Leslie had contacted Dulcie in an attempt to amicably resolve the pistol's ownership. As of this airing, we don't know the outcome.
To read more of John P. Thompson's letters during the Civil War, visit History Detectives on the web at pbs.org.
Coming up, did this amplifier belong to an unsung genius of Motown?
James Jamerson was to bass what Jimi Hendrix was to the guitar.
But first,
my name is Jan Hazel. I live in Friendsville, Tennessee. About 12 years ago, I bought an old record player in an antique store in a small town in Indiana. There was all sorts of music in there, but one record stood out. The title on one side was The Bright Fiery Cross, and the title on the other side, The Jolly Old Klansman, spelled with a K. These seemed to be references to the Ku Klux Klan.
Now, when I first heard about this story, I'm like, you know, it could be interesting, but who wants to talk about the Klan? Then when I thought about that, I was like, you know, it's actually important to talk about the Klan.
so can we take a look at the record you wanted to show me?
Okay. Our song, The Bright Fiery Cross. The Jolly Old Klansman.
Do you collect Klan materials?
No, not at all. It made me really kind of sad that if it is a Klan record, that they would use something like that to promote themselves.
Jan tried to play the 78 RPM disc, but the sound was bad and she didn't want to damage it or the record player, a model she thinks dates to 1918.
After I found that record, sometime later, I came across this.
KKK Records, yes.
Mm-hmm.
This is interesting. What do you want to know?
I would like to know if it is a Klan record, and were they really so prevalent that they produced records for people to purchase?
So I'm going to take good care of your record and your record cover, get them both back to you when I have some answers for you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The title suggests a Klan connection, but I've never heard of them recording music or selling it.
Our song, The Bright Fiery Cross, sung by 100% Americans. You know, those are just words. They take on a different meaning, however, when you're talking about the Klan. Anytime they say 100% anything, I know I'm not included. She already tried to play this. She wasn't successful. So I'm gonna let an expert play it for me. I do see that there's some etchings of some numbers on here. 11462. I have no idea what that means. But let's try The Bright Fiery Cross. Okay. I do have something here. I have the lyrics. Wow. Listen to this. Over all the USA, the fiery cross we display. This gives me very violent imagery in my head. This was a cross you put on someone's lawn because you didn't want them to live in your neighborhood. This was a cross that you burned in front of a church because you didn't want that church there.
Threats, beatings, and murder were all part of the Klan's brutal tactics. But where does this disc fit in?
Now, we do have some clues here. American Record Shop, 130 Virginia Avenue, Indianapolis, Indiana. So I'm gonna go and see what we can find in Indianapolis, Indiana.
I'm meeting a professor of African American Studies, Cornelius Bynum, who's an expert on the Klan.
Now, how did you get into the Klan?
I'm interested in issues of race and class, and the Klan figures prominently.
Here's what I got. Have you ever seen anything like this before?
I don't believe that I have.
The Bright Fiery Cross, sung by 100% Americans.
Okay, well, that's a pretty important clue right there. The Klan has a particular phrase that it uses in its second iteration in the 1920s that talks about 100% Americanism. And of course, in Indiana, there was a Klan publication called the Fiery Cross. And so those two pieces of information suggest to me that this is a Klan production.
Professor Bynum explains how the Ku Klux Klan formed in the 1860s to suppress newly freed blacks. But he suspects our disc is propaganda from a second period of organizing shortly after World War I.
As we move from the 1910s into the 1920s, increasingly Native whites become concerned about immigration, about ethnicity and religion, and certainly are concerned about African Americans leaving the South and moving north, seeking better economic and social opportunity. And in the 1920s, the Klan find new life in the Midwest, the West, and the North. And this notion of 100% Americanism is central to how the Klan markets itself outside of the South.
Professor Bynum says Jan's record could be an example of how the Klan used mass media to organize on a national stage. By the mid-1920s, Klan propaganda had helped pull in over 3 million members, with some estimates as high as 8 million nationwide.
Perhaps the most important cultural production of Klan propaganda in the early 20th century is a film called Birth of a Nation, which is the D.W. Griffith adaptation of Thomas Dixon's The Klansman, which is this kind of celebratory retrospective of the Klan in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era.
While Birth of a Nation wasn't made by the Klan, it did help inspire their resurgence. But Professor Bynum thinks our record was probably Klan-made and sold by local groups.
One of the things that strikes me about this record is that on the sleeve it says Indianapolis, and in fact that does make sense to me because Indianapolis and Indiana generally is a really important pathway for the Klan out of the South and into the Midwest.
The Indiana Klan integrated itself into the mainstream through politics, but it also employed an intimidation tactic prevalent in this second wave of organizing: the burning of a bright, fiery cross.
It represents, on the one hand, the light of salvation, but it also is representative of purification, purifying the American culture of the scourge of inferior races, inferior cultures.
So historically, it has been used to terrify African Americans and other groups.
It's a warning.
Now, would they have used something like this to play over the radio, to invoke fear?
I don't think it would have been used to invoke fear, but rather, just as with Birth of a Nation, to try to recast the violent past of the Klan as a heroic effort to preserve something essentially American, essentially white.
But the Klan's message was also associated with fearful consequences. Professor Bynum suggests that a lynching such as this one in Marion, Indiana in 1930 could be more easily justified if a man was viewed as less than 100% American.
There's no horror displayed in the faces of any of the individuals in the audience. They're in fact giving legitimacy to the taking of life in this particular context. And again, it connects directly to the kind of propaganda efforts represented by this record to recast this kind of shadowy violence as something heroic, as something noble.
Where did this record come from?
Well, things like this were widely available and could be purchased openly at most stores in communities around the country. But to find out where this record specifically came from, you'd have to talk to a records expert.
Look, thank you very much. You've been a great help. I really appreciate it.
This is a Klan recording, no doubt, but my conversation with Professor Bynum brings up more questions about who made this and where. So I'm meeting with Phil Oldham, a record collector with a special knowledge of early Klan music.
How you doing, Phil?
Good to see you.
He's brought a turntable that can safely play a 78 RPM disc.
That was put out by the Indiana Klan.
Where did this song come from?
This song is a rewrite of the Old Rugged Cross, a Protestant hymn that was copyrighted in about 1905 by Reverend George Bernard. They stole his music and put new words to it.
How big would a record like this have been? How many would have sold?
They would probably have been in the low thousands.
Phil confirms that recordings such as this were sold by local Klan group. He's unearthed a couple of items, including the publication Professor Bynum referred to.
This is the Fiery Cross newspaper. It was published every Friday here in Indianapolis. Let's look at some of the ads from the paper. Here's one for the American Record Shop.
So, is this an advertisement for our record?
It is, the Bright Fiery Cross, yeah. The Klan headquarters was also on Virginia Avenue in that same block.
And who are these guys?
This is the Logansport KKK Quartet from Logansport, Indiana. This is the group that sings on your...
Wait, these are the guys?
These are the guys.
Where was this record made?
I believe it was made in Richmond, Indiana, at a company called the Star Jeanette Company.
So my four guys would have made their way to Richmond. To where?
Star Jeanette Factory.
Field tells me these etchings are matrix numbers and says they may provide more information. He suggests I visit the Indiana Historical Society.
All right, so here are the matrix numbers that Phil has guided us to. Bam, found him. We have our 11462 and our 11462A. And now we know exactly when our record was recorded, May 16th, 1923. The bright, fiery cross, the jolly old Klansman. Okay.
Star Jeanette wasn't just making Klan records, that's for sure.
New Orleans Rhythm Kings. That don't sound Klanish at all. King Oliver and his Creole Jazz Band. You're not gonna have any Klan group calling themselves Creole anything.
And King Oliver is one of the most important names in early jazz.
This is getting interesting. I'm here to meet with Rick Kennedy to find out about the Star Jeanette recording studio.
I've mostly answered Jan's questions, but this new information has added a totally new twist.
They got Creole bands, they got blues bands, and then they got Klan bands? What's going on? I need some answers. How you doing?
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Welcome to Richmond, Indiana.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So tell me, 1920.
Yeah.
Richmond, Indiana.
Right.
What's going on in this city?
Well, this is a boom town. This is a boom industrial city. It was also the time of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan.
Rick says, like much of Indiana at the time, Richmond had a significant Klan population.
It's been estimated that 1 out of 3 Protestant males in Richmond at that time in the early 1920s were Klan members.
So talk to me about Jeanette Music Company.
Well, Jeanette Records was a subsidiary of a big piano company here called Star Piano.
Okay.
Run by the Jeanette family.
All right. These people members of the Klan?
They were not at all members of the Klan. The Jeanette family, they were Italians by descent. That would have been a complete oxymoron.
The Jeanette Company was not 100% American by Klan standards. But according to Rick, for the Klan and the Jeanettes, it was a marriage of convenience.
There was no other record company in the Midwest as important as Jeanette Records, so it was simply a business proposition of coming in with a singer and maybe a band or a piano player, and then doing what they called vanity records. So they would just give them cash up front, the Jeanettes would record them and press them. This is what's pretty much left of the great Star Piano Company, its Jeanette Records division.
All right, so this is the record, you know? What can you tell me?
You notice you see no reference to Richmond, Indiana, no reference to Jeanette?
Rick explains the Jeanette family took the Klan's money to make their records, but had no desire to be associated with the final product. He says that Jan's disc was recorded in the same studio where Jeanette had only recently made music history.
5 weeks before this record was made, King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, with this shy second cornetist named Louis Armstrong, comes down to this very spot to record a series of fantastic records, including Chimes Blues, the first solo recording of Louis Armstrong.
The same talented engineer who had recorded the Klan's disc also captured the beauty of Louis Armstrong's cornet.
The studio engineer was a man named Ezra Wickemeyer.
Wickemeyer had helped make history that day, but it seems he had a history of his own.
You wanted to know where your record came from.
It makes me really sad that they used a spiritual hymn to convey their terrible message.
I explained how her disc was a record of a time when the Klan was growing rapidly in the cities of the North and Midwest.
At the same time, the Jeanette Music Company was doing something else very different. Here we have Chimes Blues, in which Louis Armstrong plays his first recorded solo. This is the guy who produced both of those songs. This is Ezra Wickemeyer.
And he was a member of the local Ku Klux Klan chapter. And then he was also in charge of recording this particular record here on May 16, 1923, just 5 weeks later.
So these songs really represent the contradiction of race in America. That you would have the same engineer producing the bright, fiery cross for the purposes of the Klan, also producing this beautiful music which becomes historic and groundbreaking.
We can only speculate on Wickemeyer's motivations, but the contradictions between his political beliefs and his work illustrate the complex racial environment of the time.
It seems that the jazz and the good music and the goodness of the black culture has risen to the top and overcome the darkness of that song.
I couldn't have said it more clearly. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
The bright, fiery cross was recorded at the height of the Indiana Klan's power. By 1925, sex and corruption scandals among the state's KKK leadership led to a mass drop-off in membership. Jan is looking into donating the record to a museum or historical society.
And now, our final story.
I'm Steve Fishman. I've been playing the bass for 30 years professionally. I have an amplifier that I believe belonged to the great James Jamerson. James Jamerson was to bass what Jimi Hendrix was to the guitar. I want to find out for sure that it was James' actual amp.
I'm Eduardo Pagan. James Jamerson may be the greatest bass player you've never heard of. During Motown Records' golden era in Detroit, Jamerson was a member of the Funk Brothers, the largely anonymous in-house studio band. He laid the bass line for some of their most famous acts, Stevie Wonder, The Temptations, The Supremes, and Marvin Gaye, playing on nearly all of Motown's 100-plus top 10 hits. If this really is Jamerson's amp, it played a direct part in the musical revolution that was Motown.
This is fantastic. Well, where did you find this thing?
I got it from a gentleman who is an amp specialist. He told me that it had been neglected for many, many years. One day, he pulls this in and he says, look at this.
As soon as he saw the name James Jamerson, Steve knew this could be big.
Only insiders, producers, and other studio musicians knew his name. I didn't even know his name for many, many years. I just said, that Motown guy. Who is that guy? He's like, he came out of the sky, you know.
Does this produce sound still?
It sure does. It sounds great. Would you like to hear it?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay.
Well, tell me a little bit about this amplifier.
The most important thing is that it is a tube amplifier, and tubes give a sense of warmth. In fact, they're actually burning. They actually have fire in them. Yeah. If you feel them, they're warm.
Oh, yeah. So would you characterize this as a kind of warmer sound?
Warm and sweet, but it can get pretty gritty. And a lot of the stuff that they did, and James Jamerson did, was pretty gritty stuff, pretty hardcore.
Although 2 letters are missing, Steve says the amplifier is an Ampeg, an American-made brand popular with bass players from the early days of rock and roll. Steve says it's the kind of sound Jamerson liked, but is this his amp? He's never been able to find a picture to prove it.
Now, how do we know that some entrepreneur somewhere found this amplifier consistent with what Jamerson used and decided to put his name on the side? I mean, that's possible, right?
Very possible.
I grew up listening to Motown, and I'm very familiar with Marvin Gaye, Diana Ross, and above all, Berry Gordy, the visionary who created the first African-American music label to hit it big with white America. Steve is right. There are plenty of pictures of Jamerson, but no clear shots of his amp. Many of the Detroit clubs where the Motown sound was first heard are now shuttered. But I got word that there's one spot I have to check out.
Hewitt's Music Store has been selling gear to Motor City musicians since the 1920s, and I understand that James Jamerson was a former customer. So I'm on my way there to see if they can help me out.
I'm meeting music buffs and Motown fans Tim Hewitt and Ufuma Wallace.
What are you guys doing? I am doing some research on this amplifier, and I hear that you are the two who can tell me about it.
Don't believe everything you hear.
Did Jamerson ever come into the store?
He did, but I only heard stories from my grandfather because this is way before my time.
Yeah.
Tim explains how the artists of Motown left their mark on Detroit and the world. During a time of civil unrest, they shattered race barriers and chart records, making African-American music styles popular to the masses. And musicians like James Jamerson were vital to this revolutionary Motown sound.
What can you tell me about this amp? I mean, why was this the preferred amp of bass players?
That had the 15-inch speakers, so you had that big, round, full sound because the bass players were upright players.
Yeah.
And then in the 60s, when the electronics came in, they had to make that transfer over to the new electrical sound. Yeah. But they were still trying to capture the upright tone through the electrical instruments. Right. And James Jamerson did an excellent job of that.
Ufuma says the Ampeg allowed bass players to still produce that upright sound, but with an amplified edge. And Jamerson took it to a whole new level.
He played with a syncopation that prior to him was not heard really in bass players. Yeah. Because they played more root and the blues and that kind of stuff. And he came into and that just amazed everybody. And from that point on, bass started progressing and progressing and progressing. Yeah. And that's why all the bass players from Detroit bass players have a definite sound, a definite style that they can even go anywhere in the world because of Jamerson.
Do you think it's possible that this was actually sold to James Jamerson?
We would not have the records because that would be like 50 years ago. Yeah. Well, we couldn't say exactly. I do know that this is a model of B15N, which my grandfather did sell him. And then he came back a couple months later and we sold him an extension speaker. So actually we sold him 2 amps.
Without store records, there's no way to confirm that our amp was sold here. But Tim has a lead.
I didn't meet Senior. I met, of course, Junior, who I played with for the Funk Brothers.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think you still have his contact information?
Yes, I really do. And if you're good to me right now, I'll give you his phone number, okay?
In the early 1960s, Motown was headquartered in downtown Detroit, where legendary producer Berry Gordy oversaw hit after hit. Inside, the basement studio was known as the Snake Pit, where the up-and-coming stars of Motown were backed by the uncredited house bass player. James Jamerson died in 1983. I'm meeting with James Jr., who literally got a child's eye view of the birth of Motown.
This is hallowed ground for some of us.
Oh, yeah, well, this is the room I grew up in. From 9 years old, and it's, wow. Yeah. All this history in here, and I learned from all those guys. All those guys were like my surrogate father, but there's only one dad.
Because I'm thinking about my 9-year-old. He would have gotten bored and left after a while.
Oh, no, I was excited. When they say funk, it got so funky in here.
Before Motown, James Jr. says the bass had taken a back seat in popular music.
You really didn't hear the bass. I mean, you just hear. And you never heard the bass. You heard the guitars, you heard the pianos, and you heard the singers.
Right. Give us a sense then, and then when your father comes along, what does he introduce? What's the sound that he gives us?
He gives a very fat sound, very unique sound. And it became like, whoa, what's that? And it's like, that's what we're looking for. He was very melodic in his playing, so he had a style.
Why do you think he was so unrecognized in his day?
It was Motown's little secret. Barry didn't want everybody having them because they was making too many hit records. You know, that was their little secret, like their little secret weapon, like, hey, we got something that you ain't got.
Yeah. Well, I imagine you've seen a lot of your father's equipment. Have you ever seen this before?
James Jr. tells me in the early 1990s, one of his father's amplifiers was stolen from a storage locker. But he says this one is not that missing amp.
Too many knobs. He didn't have no 2-volume knobs. There's only 1-volume knob.
Well, I thought we had a sure thing. Your dad's name is right there.
I know it, and it looked very familiar.
So even though your father's name is right here,
even though it's there,
you're not convinced.
I'm not convinced.
I'm starting to suspect that we may have a fake on our hands. How do I know that this amp wasn't just dressed up to look like a 60s-era Ampeg? I've asked amplifier expert Greg Hopkins to take a closer look.
Greg, this is the mystery. So I wonder if you can confirm for me, first of all, this is an authentic Ampeg?
It's an Ampeg B15.
And Greg thinks he can pinpoint the year it was made. He first looks for the serial number plate, but it's missing. Fortunately, there are other clues to check.
Inside on the controls, there's going to be some numbers on the inside that will tell who manufactured those parts and what year they were manufactured. They're kind of hard to see. I do see what appears to be a 62. I can barely read it. Okay, I see a date of 62/13. 13 would be the week of that year.
So that means the amp is authentic to the right era.
Now, anything else jumps out to you that could help me authenticate this to James Jamerson?
It says James Jamerson on the side.
You know.
It's possible somebody could fake a thing like that, but it looks like that's been on there for a long time.
The amp is from the early 1960s, when Jamerson was almost completely unknown to a popular audience. He didn't really get full recognition for his music until long after his death. So would someone really fake a stencil at this point in his career, or even a couple of decades later?
If anyone could recognize whether this amp belonged to James Jamerson, it would be someone who played alongside him, like one of the Funk Brothers.
I've gotten in touch with Dennis Coffey, another member of the Motown Records studio musicians.
Usually there are about 12 of us in the studio. Our job was to read the music, add some kind of feel, because you can't write the feel on paper. We had to add a great feel to it.
What was it like to play with James Jamerson?
James, to me, was just the best bass player in the world. I mean, you could hear it.
Dennis found a recording for me. It's from a late 1960s Detroit club gig, which sat in his drawer for 25 years.
You can hear Jamerson doing pure Jamerson, okay?
This is James Jamerson. Let's give Jamerson a big round of applause. Really beautiful James.
Always laying down the groove, but then he'd stretch out, but he was always laying that pocket. That's what the guys at Motown were so good at. I was always about the feel and laying that pocket down. That's what drove those records, I think.
The Motown musicians were in high demand. In the early 70s, Berry Gordy moved Motown from Detroit to L.A., where a select few of the guys worked harder than ever.
I remember getting to the studio at 10 a.m. in the morning and bouncing on sessions up and down, and I didn't get home till 4 a.m. the next day. So that was my first day doing sessions and playing guitar at Motown.
I am trying to determine whether this amplifier right here belonged to James Jamerson. Can you tell me anything about this?
The only thing that I can tell you about that stencil is if you look on my amplifier, I have the same stencil.
Steve has got to hear what Dennis tells me next.
Steve, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
It's good to see you. I gotta tell you, this has been one heck of an adventure.
I explained that although a music store identified it as the same model Jamerson bought, His son certainly wasn't convinced that this amplifier had ever belonged to his dad.
Oh. Interesting.
Yeah. I wasn't sure what I had until funk brother Dennis Coffey came to my rescue. In Detroit, in an earlier era, musicians hauled their own instruments and gear. But Los Angeles was a much larger city and studios were further afield, so cartage companies transported musicians' equipment around town.
And they showed up with the trunk with my name on the outside of the trunk, and this amp had my name stenciled on it. They got to run in and instantly identify whose amp that is and look on their schedule and say, well, okay, Dennis Coffey is over to this studio, and Jamerson might be at a different studio. I'm assuming this Royal Ink was probably maybe the warehouse or something, but Studio Instrument Rentals did that, and if you notice, it's the same type of stencil.
He believes that we may have uncovered a piece of music history.
This is the amp I used out in L.A., and that's the one that Jamerson used in L.A.
Take a look at that stenciling right there.
Very interesting.
Look at that. There's his name right there, and it's a pretty good match.
That's pretty amazing.
It's not the smoking gun I'd love to be able to have, but it's pretty good. It's as close as I can get.
That's close enough for rock and roll. That's pretty good for me.
I've got a surprise for you.
Oh, I love surprises.
I'm giving Steve a ride to a one-of-a-kind jam session.
Gentlemen, this is Steve Fishman. He's an enormous fan of early Motown. Dennis Coffey and James Jamerson Jr.
How you doing, sir? Nice to meet you.
Can we sit in?
Sure.
Absolutely. All right, thank you.
In 2000, 17 years after his death, James Jamerson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and Steve plans to loan this amp to their collection.
Funding for tonight's presentation of History Detectives was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Just like watching the detectives.